Hello everyone, this video is to accompany the written syllabus chapter on the vertebral column and muscles of the back, and in this particular segment we'll be looking at the muscles of the back. Again, you're going to use the iPad and one of the many anatomy programs that one can get on the iPad. This time I'm using Essential Anatomy 4 from 3D for Medical to do a virtual dissection of the muscles of the back and give you some overview of the different layers. And these will be useful not only for following in the syllabus chapter, but it will be useful when you come to the anatomy lab to do the dissections. So let's start looking at some of the muscles of the back. So let's start with the whole body, and we're going to concentrate on the muscles of the back, and we'll just be concentrating on this area. But you'll notice that I've already removed some of the muscles on this side. If you compare them here, you'll see the deltoids are gone, because it will help in our visualization of some of these back muscles later on. So let's look in detail at the area of interest. The first muscle that we want to look at is the trapezius. The origin of this muscle is both on the occiput, a ligament that runs along these cervical vertebrae called the ligamentum nuchae, and also the spinous process of the thoracic segments. The insertion is on the lateral third of the clavicle and the scapular spine. And so you can see that as this muscle contracts, we're going to get retraction, superior rotation, elevation, and depression of the scapula, depending on which parts of the muscle retract. And again, remember that the scapula is the articular surface for the limb, for the upper limb, so moving this scapula will also move the limb. So let's hide that muscle, and let's move forward a little and look at the next muscle, which is the latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi is attached to the spinous processes of T7 to L4 or 5 down here. And interestingly enough, it's actually inserted in the intertubercular groove of the humerus. And the way that we can see that, I've removed these muscles. I've removed a lot of the muscles from the shoulder already, and if we now rotate this section, you can see that this muscle, which began in the back, is actually attached to the intertubercular groove of the humerus, so that as it pulls, it's going to medially rotate, abduct, and extend the arm. So again, even though it's from the back, it actually goes around to the front of the humerus. So let's hide that. Now these two muscles that we've been looking at are part of the extrinsic muscles or hypaxial muscles, and they're part of the superficial group. The next muscles we want to look at are the rhomboid major and rhomboid minor. Now we'll consider these as one group, so we'll select both of them. And we can see that their origins are on the spinous processes of C7 to about T5, and they insert onto the medial border of the scapula. They stabilize the scapula and they move the inferior angle backwards and upwards. And so again, remember that the scapula is the articular surface for the upper limb, so moving the scapula is also going to move the limb. So we'll hide these. And go to the next muscle of the superficial group, which is this muscle here, which is the levator scapulae. As you can imagine, levator sounds like elevator. You'd lift it up, and the scapula is the scapulae. So it's actually attached, although it looks as though it goes up here to the skull, it's actually attached to the transverse processes of C1 to C4, and then it attaches to the medial, the insertion is on the medial border of the scapula, and so contraction of this muscle is obviously going to elevate the scapula medially and upwards. So we can now hide this muscle. And now we're still in the extrinsic superficial muscles, but now we're going to move down to the intermediate group. And that's this group here, which is the serratus posterior superior group. Now their origin is the supraspinal ligament and the ligamentum nuchae, which I've already talked about, which runs down here on the posterior aspect of the cervical segments from C7 to L3. And they insert onto the upper borders of ribs 2 and 5. So it's not very clear how that would happen unless we get rid of some of this. Let's remove the scapula. And let's remove the serratus anterior. And now we can see that the serratus posterior superior does actually connect to the ribs. So these muscles are going to elevate the ribs during respiration. So we'll hide those and we'll move back to the next group of muscles, which are down here, which are the serratus posterior inferior. Now these have their origin on the supraspinal ligament and the spinous processes of T11 to L3, as you can see here, and they insert on the lower borders of ribs 9 to 12. These muscles, when they contract, are going to draw and lower the lower ribs backwards and downwards during exhalation. Okay, so now let's look at some of the intrinsic muscles, or the epaxial muscles. These come under the large group called erector spinae, or paraspinal muscles, and they're divided into smaller groups. And we'll start by looking at the most medial group, which are called the Iliocostalis. In fact, the Iliocostalis divided into 3 groups of muscles, but we're just going to treat them as a single group of muscles, and so I'll highlight them all so you can see them here. So these muscles have got various insertions. The different groups have got various insertions and origins that vary between the transverse processes of the vertebra right down to the iliac crest. The action of these muscles, depending which group they use, are generally to extend the vertebral column and assist in the lateral movements of the trunk. So those are the Iliocostalis muscles. So let's hide those. And now we'll look at the next set of muscles, which are longissimus. And these really stretch almost the entire length of the back. Again, they're the intrinsic muscles. They're divided into 3 groups, once again, depending on the origins and insertions of the different groups. And again, the origins and insertions range from the iliac crest, the transverse processes of thoracic ribs, thoracic vertebra, excuse me, up here, thoracic vertebra, and the ribs. The function of these is to the extension and lateral flexion of the neck and head. So let's hide this group. And our final group here, spinalis. Once again, there are several different subsets of these spinalis, and origin and insertion varies between the 3 groups. Those with their origin and insertion on the vertebral column extend the vertebral column, while those with the origin of the vertebral column and insertion on the skull extend the head. So we'll hide those, but there's one group, further group, which are part of these erector spinae muscles that I want to talk about, called Multifidus. And these are very interesting because you can see in this view that they have their origin on the transverse processes of the C2 to L5 vertebra, so the majority of the vertebra, and they insert on the spinous process of the more superior vertebra here. So these are very important in stabilizing the vertebral column. They maintain posture, and they can actually also slightly rotate and extend the vertebral column. So they're very important in the maintenance of the vertebral column. So that was a brief overview of the muscles, the extrinsic, the hypaxial, and the intrinsic muscles, the epaxial muscles of the back. And when you come to lab, you will actually be dissecting through these layers, and hopefully this virtual dissection will have given you an idea of how to go about finding these different muscles.